Okay, hello everyone, this is Colin Cox, and today I want to talk about the Tennessee Williams play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Certainly an interesting play, at times a challenging play, but some of the themes, and you could easily take one of these themes and explore it in a longer essay. And I won't talk about all of them today. Some of them intersect in interesting ways, but some of the themes for this play, loneliness, searching and discovery, and maybe we could even use a word like desire when thinking about words like searching and discovery, self-immolation, sex and violence, and I'll certainly talk about how, in particular, sex and desire are two ideas or two concepts that are intimately connected in this play. Class and even racial dynamics, power and control. Again, I think it's interesting how ideas or themes like power and control intersect with sex, desire, etc. And then finally, just at large, and I've mentioned several of these already, sex, love, and romance. Obviously, one of the most important themes, obviously one of the most important collection of themes in the play, just thinking how those three terms, sex, love, and romance, work together and with one another. So what I won't do is talk about each scene in isolation. Instead, what I want to do is talk about two important themes and then tether or connect those other themes that I just mentioned to those two bigger or larger themes. And the first one is desire, and the second one is fantasy. And again, I don't want you to think that these themes are disconnected from one another. What I think is interesting about what Williams does, he finds an effective way of actually connecting and tethering all of these themes together. But fantasy is one that I will spend most of my time today discussing. But before I do that, I wanted to say a quick something. I wanted to offer a brief character sketch of our four main or principal characters: Stanley, Stella, Blanche, and Mitch. And I'll start with Stanley. So Stanley, he is this, you could argue, hyper masculine, but perhaps even crassly masculine. There's something crass about his masculinity. We find, for example, at times that Blanche uses animalistic language to describe him. And I think for someone like Williams, he almost wants to connect Stanley's self-conception of himself as a masculine figure to perhaps Blanche's more reductive and insulting animalistic descriptors of him as not just a person, but again, as a distinctly masculine individual. But he's also a source of objectification. I think we see this quite often when we see how he interacts with his wife, Stella, and then, of course, later in the play when he rapes Blanche. But and this is what's interesting about a character like Stanley, he seems to, instead of reject this idea of himself as, quote, unrefined, he seems to embrace it. He takes what would otherwise be an insult and a pejorative, and he again adopts it and takes it to a particular sort of extreme. And this is something I think we see quite often in the work of Tennessee Williams, characters taking ideas to particular extremes. But Stanley is also, and I think this is almost exclusively with Blanche, a skeptical character and a skeptical figure. And I think this is where, and it's complicated to talk about any of these characters as likable or even redeemable, because I think they're all to varying degrees quite despicable, Stanley in particular. But I think his skepticism is something that students actually like about him, because Blanche, even though she experiences a sexual assault at the end of the play. And while that would certainly make her, and I think that does make her a sympathetic character, that doesn't mean she's an innocent character. And that doesn't mean that she is necessarily wholly benevolent. She, like so many of the characters in Williams's plays, is a deeply complicated and conflicting character. But Stanley's skepticism of her is quite interesting because it seems to suggest that whatever trick she has successfully pulled or perpetrated on others, and I think there's even some skepticism for us as readers how successful she's been in the past, but I guess the point is whatever trick she's pulled or whatever trick she's perpetrated on others, someone like Stanley, he doesn't believe it even for a moment. And I think you could potentially argue that perhaps part of the reason why is because of this just unmistakable misogyny that's perhaps one of the defining qualities and characteristics of a figure like Stanley. He seems to regrettably possess a fair amount, a disproportionate amount of anger, perhaps hate and resentment towards so many of the women who occupy this play, and perhaps the women who just occupy the world that he also occupies. Now, Stella, his wife, at least at the beginning of the play, and I think there is this important moment in scene 3 when she asserts herself in interesting ways, but Stella throughout, especially the beginning of the play, is quite quiet, and she even seems compliant. You could even argue there's something infantile about her. William seems to infantilize her at times. And again, we'll talk about how she reacts in particular to Blanche at the end of the play, but save this one particular moment in scene 3, she is quite compliant throughout the play. And one of the ways that I'll talk about Stella is to think of her as a character who sits between a figure like Stanley on one side and Blanche on the other. And those two characters, Stanley and Blanche, they seem to be vying not just for her affection, but even her allegiance. And there is this sense that whomever she identifies with, whatever qualities and characteristics they embody, they're the ones, and perhaps by extension, those qualities and characteristics win the day. And I mentioned a moment ago that I want to talk about a concept like fantasy because I think it's quite obvious. In particular, if you think about how Williams manipulates the stage in moments when Blanche fantasizes, I think it's quite obvious that Blanche is a signifier, or Blanche represents fantasy, but on the other side we have Stanley, who seems to just represent whatever the opposite of fantasy is. Perhaps if you wanted to call it reality, I'm not sure, but it feels, at least I want to argue, that there's something about Stella positioned between those two, and we know how the play ends, so we know ultimately perhaps who wins the day. It's not fantasy that wins the day, it's reality, or again, whatever the opposite of fantasy might be. Now, with a character like Blanche, again, is an endlessly fascinating character because she seems to embody so many interesting and thought-provoking contradictions. She's something of a scandalous character, especially the more we learn about her past and the things she's done or the things characters accuse her of doing. But she's also someone defined by her shame. And I think this is part of how fantasy inserts itself into this play. Fantasy as a supplement that helps her in some ways live with the consequences of her choices and live with her shame. But she is, again, something of a shameful character at times, which is, I think, part of why, or one of the reasons why characters often identify with or sympathize with a character like Blanche. And because of this shame, we often don't see Blanche clearly she's a character who's so often hidden. Pay attention and think about, for example, how dedicated she is to having characters like Mitch, for example, only see her in a certain kind of light, or in a poorly lit or a low lit environment. She's someone who just embodies this idea or this notion of shame and hiding. And because of that, she's also quite delicate at times. And I know a word like delicate might have certain gender or sexual connotations to it, and maybe that's an accusation or a criticism you could make of Tennessee Williams. His characters feel quite cisgendered, if we wanted to use that sort of language. His characters feel quite cisgendered, and because of that, again, perhaps there is a degree of misogyny attached to or associated with his characterization of Blanche. But what I ultimately think is interesting about her is how, perhaps despite how delicate, and again I would even use scare quotes, but despite how delicate and unstable she seems, she takes the idea of fantasy to particular sorts of extremes, the kinds of extremes that we don't often see or that we don't often associate with characters like Blanche. When we think about characters who take certain ideas or take certain injunctions to particular extremes, I think we all have an image in our head of what those characters look like. And I'm not entirely sure, and challenge me if you think I'm wrong, but I'm not entirely sure we see characters like Blanche when we think about characters who take ideas or take injunctions to particular extremes. But with Blanche, it's fantasy and the importance of fantasy. But I think what we also see with a character like Blanche, and I think we see this is perhaps representative with all of these four main characters, is a distinct idea of, again, what desire means and what desire looks like, and perhaps how human beings want to be desired and how they even want to desire themselves. Because I think that's, as strange as it might sound, I think that's perhaps what a character like Stanley and Blanche share. They seem to desire others in frighteningly similar ways, because I think there's a degree of power associated with how Blanche desires, and I think with Stanley there's a similar sort of power and even dominance associated with how he wants to desire people. So again, you would think these two characters, they presumably wouldn't share any characteristics, but I think that is perhaps something they do share, and maybe this actually blends with other characters, because I think you could argue that maybe Stella at times desires in a similar sort of way. And finally, we have a character like Mitch, who seems to function as a foil to a character like Stanley. And when you hear someone use a term like foil, what that ultimately means is a character that's a foil for another character is a character who, in many ways, is actually quite similar to this other character. So if we wanted to use Mitch and Stanley as examples, Mitch is a foil to Stanley because they are quite similar in distinct ways, but it's those differences that really matter, and that's part of what makes Mitch a foil, because by contrast to a character like Stanley, Mitch seems quite sensitive, and what he seems to want, at least at the beginning of the play, and part of how I'll talk about Mitch is to talk about him as a character who seems to devolve into Stanley in some ways near the end of the play. But at the beginning, the way Williams sketches him, it is as a distinct and unmistakable foil to Stanley, because his sensitivity and his care, in particular, his care for a character like Blanche, works and functions in complete contrast to not just how Stanley seems to interact with the world, because he doesn't seem like a terribly sensitive person, but specifically how he interacts with Blanche. Again, he doesn't seem to have the same sort of forgiveness. He's not nearly as sensitive with her as someone like Mitch seems to be. So why don't we turn to the text now, and I want to go to the end of scene 3, and specifically around pages 98 or 99. And I will read from the play on occasion, but I think I'll save that for later. So it's this poker night, and Stanley, after drinking quite heavily, strikes Stella, and for a time, Stella and Blanche retreat to Eunice's apartment, which is above theirs. But Stanley then starts just howling, it seems, uncontrollably out in the street. And you'll notice more, and this is in the stage directions, but Williams describes him as something of an animal, again, using that sort of language. And this is maybe an interesting moment to pause and think about the effects of describing human beings as animals, because I think the obvious effect it has is to create this kind of hierarchy, because I think that's often when you see these kinds, or when you see this kind of language deployed, I think it's meant to suggest a kind of hierarchy. Anytime you or I or anyone else describes a person or a group of people as animals, it seems to suggest they are perhaps not as sophisticated as, and perhaps they simply don't matter as much as people. And I think this particular moment has that kind of effect, where we're meant to think of Stanley as not nearly as important and not nearly as significant as other characters in the play. But Stanley, he's not alone, because Stella eventually joins him. And I do want to read some of the stage directions here on page 99. The low-tone clarinet moans. The door upstairs opens again. Stella slips down the rickety stairs in her robe. Her eyes are glistening with tears, and her hair loose about her throat and shoulders. They stare at each other. Then they come together with low animal moans. He falls to his knees on the steps and presses his face to her belly, curving a little with maternity. Her eyes go blind with tenderness as she catches his head and raises him level with her. He snatches the screen door open and lifts her off her feet and bears her into the dark flat. Blanche comes out the upper landing in her robe and slips fearfully down the steps. So here, and I'll say a little more about why I think this moment matters, but one of the important things Williams suggests here is how similar Stanley and Stella seem to desire. Again, they come together with low animal moans. So for example, part of what Blanche can't quite seem to understand about this relationship is what Stella, according to Blanche, considering her background, what Stella finds attractive about Stanley. And I think we're getting a clear sense of it here. The thing they share, the quality or characteristic they share, is perhaps how they desire. And it's a kind of desire that perhaps retreats from the refined civility that Blanche tries to embody, or that Blanche tries to exercise out into the world. And it's something quite raw. It's something almost primitive. It's something stripped of all of the artifice that we often associate with those who are, again, all of this is arbitrary, but those who are higher on this hierarchical scale. And I think that's part of what scandalizes Blanche so much, is this sense that this is perhaps degrading for a person, but I think that's precisely what Blanche seems to enjoy about it. And we get a clearer sense of this at the beginning of the next scene when Stella describes what her first night after their wedding, what her first night with Stanley was like. And this is the bottom of page 100 and over onto page 101. No, it isn't all right for anybody to make such a terrible row, but people do sometimes. Stanley always smashed things. Why, on our wedding night, soon as we came in here, he snatched off one of my slippers and rushed about the place smashing light bulbs with it. He did what? And this is Blanche. But he smashed all the light bulbs with the heel of my slipper. And then we have a stage note, or a note. She laughs. And notice how this laugh, again, I would encourage you to think about what you make of this, because I think it seems to suggest that she enjoys this behavior. Perhaps she enjoys living with someone, or she enjoys spending time with someone who is in complete contradiction to, or functions and lives in complete contradiction to, presumably how she spent her life, or her life prior to her marriage with Stanley, especially if we think about Blanche as a kind of projection of that sort of refined Southern civility. This is the complete opposite, and Stella seems to certainly enjoy this. Again, she takes a kind of manic pleasure in it, and even later down the page, we see even more of this. And I'm sorry, this is actually a couple of pages later. If you look, for example, at the bottom of 103, she and Blanche are still talking. I am not going to say anything more at all about it. All right, then don't. And this is Stella. This is important. But there are things that happen between a man and a woman in the dark. That sort of make everything else seem unimportant. Then there's a pause. Blanche responds. What you are talking about is brute desire, just desire, the name of that rattletrap streetcar that bangs through the quarter, up one old narrow street and down another, to which Stella replies, and this is such a spectacular reply, haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar? So again, I think here this helps to crystallize what I was talking about a few pages ago, this idea that what Blanche embodies, the kind of ethos that she projects, is one that doesn't perhaps necessarily reject the idea that human beings can and should behave in this way, but it does attempt to hide it or suppress it or cover it in some way. Whereas a character like Stanley, he just embodies it all the time. There's no artifice with him, because I think part of what we learn about Blanche is she has ridden on that streetcar. This is not so foreign to her, but so much of her affect, so much of her ethos is defined by her desire to suppress the idea that she would behave this way, or that she would desire in such a brute and uncivilized way. And that gets us to one of, again, the more interesting themes in this play about worlds changing. Blanche embodies this old world, and in Williams's play, it seems to be fading and to be consumed by this newer world that Stanley seems to embody. And Blanche, even though she is far from perfect, there is this sense that Williams wants to ask his reader, or Williams encourages his reader to consider the consequences of allowing men like Stanley to assert control in the world. Again, that is not to say that Blanche is perfect, and that's not to say that the ethos and the ideas that she embodies are perfect, but that is perhaps one of the confrontations that Williams wants to stage in this play, and I think it gets back to something I said before about the confrontation between fantasy on one side and this kind of brute, uncivilized, animalistic behavior on the other, and just how at least Williams wants to stage a confrontation between those two. Now, from here, I want to talk about the end of Scene 5, because this is, again, one of the more interesting moments where I think we see the similarities between characters like Blanche and Stanley, because we see Blanche behaving like something of a predator here. Maybe not something like a predator. We see Blanche behaving like a predator here. And I'll start on page 109, and I would encourage you to just pay attention to how anytime we have these elongated scenes or sequences with Blanche, they have this effect of feeling dreamlike. And I think this is something that, again, Williams associates with a character like Blanche. The logic of her life and the logic of her world is more of a dream logic, which feels, again, in complete contrast to Stanley and however you would want to define him. But we see Blanche interacting with this young man, and I think I'll probably start reading around around page 110, because I do want to read a little bit of this. So I'll start at the top, and I'll start with what Blanche says. "You make my mouth water." Again, just, boy, that's tough to read. She touches his cheek lightly and smiles, then goes to the trunk. "Well, I'd better be going." "Young man." He turns. She takes a large gossamer scarf from the trunk and drapes it about her shoulders. In the ensuing pause, the blue piano is heard. It continues through the rest of this scene and the opening of the next. The young man clears his throat and looks yearningly at the door. "Young man, young man, has anyone ever told you that you look like a young prince out of the Arabian Nights?" The young man laughs uncomfortably and stands like a bashful kid. Blanche speaks softly to him. "Well, you do, honey lamb. Come here. I want to kiss you just once, softly and sweetly, on your mouth." Without waiting for him to accept, she crosses quickly to him and presses her lips to his. "Now, run along now, quickly. It would be nice to keep you, but I've got to be good and keep my hands off children." So there is something, as I mentioned a moment ago, unmistakably predatory about this behavior. But the thing that I always want my students to ask or think about when thinking about this moment is, why does Williams include it here? Now, I think it's important, and I think once you read the play, it becomes clear why he includes it, because this is not an isolated moment for Blanche, and this is, in a rather tragic way, a symbol or a signifier of Blanche's inability to move beyond the past. Because if you read into scene 6, you know that this moment at the end of scene 5, it's like she's just repeating what she's done in the past. So again, we're seeing this not as an isolated moment disconnected from Blanche's past, but for a character like Blanche, just a continual recapitulation of her past. And that's not under any circumstances to excuse it, but I think what Williams wants to suggest, or maybe one of the things, because I certainly don't think there's one single reading, it's a way of casting Blanche as a distinctly tragic figure who refuses to, or perhaps a better way to frame it, is incapable of moving beyond the past. And I think we see this in a myriad of ways with this character. The way she dresses, I've already talked about this in this lecture. Her affect, it's representative in some ways of the past. Even her unwillingness to accept and acknowledge the fact that she's someone who ages. This is also a way of casting her as a character who is just wedded to the past and unable unable to move beyond it. But that moment in scene 6 that I spoke about, this is on page 115, and I think it's worth reading some of it because, again, this gives us a clearer sense of what that moment at the end of scene 5 means, and I think it contextualizes it. Again, it doesn't excuse it because I think Williams is kind of working beyond that kind of allegorical, perhaps, reading of or rendering of a text. He's not interested in giving his reader unambiguously good characters and unambiguously bad characters. He seems to be interested in perhaps something else, maybe something bigger, something more subtle. But this is on page 115, and this is Blanche. It's near the end of the page. He was a boy, just a boy, when I was a very young girl. When I was 16, I made the discovery. Love, all at once and much, much too completely. It was like you suddenly turned a blinding light on something that had always been half in shadow. That's how it struck the world for me, but I was unlucky, deluded. There was something different about the boy, a nervousness, a softness, a tenderness, which wasn't like a man's, although he wasn't the least bit effeminate looking. Still, that thing was there. He came to me for help. I didn't know that. I didn't find out anything till after our marriage, when we'd run away and come back, and all I knew was I'd failed him in some mysterious way and wasn't able to give the help he needed, but couldn't speak of. He was in the quicksands and clutches. He was in the quicksands and clutching at me, but I wasn't holding him out. I was slipping in with him. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything except I loved him unenduringly, but without being able to help him or help myself. Then I found out, in the worst of all possible ways, by coming suddenly into a room that I thought was empty, which wasn't empty but had two people in it, the boy I had married and an older man who had been his friend for years. So what's I think quite clear is, and I think it's important to acknowledge when Williams wrote this, being closeted was quite common and remained quite common for many, many years. It is still quite common today, but Blanche, it seems from what she describes, married a closeted man and did so unknowingly. And I think perhaps even worse for her, she married him without knowing, but she also fell in love with him without knowing. And as you continue to read in this scene, we learn that due to a series of unfortunate circumstances, she reacted in a particular way, and eventually he committed suicide. So not only does Blanche carry the regret, perhaps, of falling in love with someone who could never love her, but she was also perhaps culpable in his suicide, or she seems to think that she behaved in a way that created the conditions for him to commit suicide. So part of how I encourage students to think about this is to think about, well, what does this say about Blanche as a symbol or a signifier of the past? Does she perhaps want to retreat to a time before she knew this, a time that was far less complicated, a time when perhaps she was innocent? Or is perhaps what she suggests in moments like this is she wants to retreat to a time before she's made the decisions she's made? And again, I think all of that, without ever excusing any of her behavior, I think all of that has the effect of rendering her an unmistakably tragic figure. And I think this is something Williams is quite good at doing. His tragic figures are not these unimpeachably good characters. They are complicated characters, yet I think he finds an interesting and effective way to encourage us as audience members to sympathize with those characters. And I think this is something that the best writers and the best playwrights have done throughout just the history of literature. If you think, for example, about a figure like William Shakespeare, some of his most identifiable and iconic characters were those characters who were by no means perfect and made many, many mistakes. Hamlet, for example, is an endlessly unlikable character, and I think Blanche follows in that particular tradition. But again, if Blanche is a figure who, as Williams characterizes her, if Blanche is a figure who wants to retreat into the past, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think Stanley is a figure who wants to just charge into the future, and by doing so, perhaps break or destroy some of the notions and assumptions that define the past, at least as he sees it, and also continue to define the present, and perhaps without Stanley's intervention would continue to, or would define the future. And I think we see this beautifully crystallized in scene 8 on page 124. And here he and Stella are speaking to one another, and this is what Stanley says. "When you first met me and you thought I was common. How right you was, baby. I was common as dirt. You showed me the snapshot of the places with the columns. I pulled you down off them columns and how you loved it, having them colored lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here?" So what Stanley says here, I think, is quite interesting. This notion that he pulled Stella down, because I think as readers, we're encouraged to think, well, pulled her down from what to what? And I'll leave it to you to decide what that ultimately means, but I'll give you maybe one suggestion or one way to read it, that what he's ultimately perhaps saying by suggesting that he pulled Stella down is he simultaneously did the work of destroying the past and destroying the sorts of ideas and assumptions that defined the past. That's perhaps one way of thinking about what this pulling down symbolizes or suggests or signifies, that for someone like Stanley, it wasn't just about this single isolated individual. It was about something much bigger, something more, something that moved him from the past and perhaps moved his world from the past into the future, a future that's defined, again, by a character like Stanley, the sorts of ideas and assumptions that Stanley embodies. And I think you could argue in scene 9, when Blanche and Mitch's date reaches fever pitch, this exchange functions as a kind of prelude to what happens later in the play. This is on page 126. And again, this also perhaps reinforces or clarifies exactly what Blanche represents. And again, it's something I would love to know what you think about what Blanche says here. This is near the bottom of the page. Mitch says, "So I can take a look at you good and plain." And here, this is that part of the conversation where he's challenging Blanche because of something I mentioned earlier in the lecture, how she's always hiding herself. Mitch, in particular, never gets a good look at her, to which she replies, "Of course, you don't really mean to be insulting." To which he says, "No, just realistic." And Blanche, and I think this is such an important moment, I would circle this or highlight this, "I don't want realism. I want magic. Yes, magic. I try to give that to people. I misrepresent things to them. I don't tell truth. I tell what ought to be truth. And if that is sinful, then let me be damned for it. Don't turn the light on." And I think this is such an interesting moment where what Blanche ultimately says is, not only is the truth insufficient, but by contrast, a good lie is far, far better. Isn't that what we ultimately want? Is a good lie, a convenient lie, a provocative lie, instead of the truth? The truth, according to Blanche, is just not enough. Again, I tell what ought to be true. And I think in that way, again, we have this clear sense of just how important fantasy is for a character like Blanche. She doesn't see the world as it should be. She sees the world as it ought to be. And I think for Blanche, even though she overindulges this, I think there's something almost ethical about overindulging in fantasy, the way she describes it, because what's the alternative? I think, regrettably, the alternative is Stanley. And that is perhaps not an alternative that any of us would necessarily want, but I think what this moment does, and I think here Williams is doing an interesting bit of work of not only challenging and criticizing the particular moment he lived in, but I think he's previewing a lot of the conversations that we even have today. Again, this tyranny of realism was something that he saw in the theater of his day that seemed to trouble him. And I think we're still very much living under or we're subjected to the tyranny of realism. And we almost seem to dismiss fantasy, the kind of fantasy that Blanche embodies, as nonsensical, juvenile, naive, so on and so forth. But I think for someone like Williams, what Blanche embodies, what she represents, and how what she embodies and represents seems to just permeate the play. Again, pay attention to all of those stage directions where the music and the lighting and everything seems to change and shift, in particular when Blanche fantasizes. So again, I think Williams, he's doing something interesting with the idea of fantasy in this play, and that perhaps affords us an opportunity to read Stanley's rape of Blanche in a multitude of different ways, because I think it's obviously awful and disgusting, and I think it represents, again, just the disproportionate amount of power that men like Stanley seem to have in the world as Williams understands it. But I think if you almost wanted to read it symbolically and metaphorically, because I think Williams encourages us to do so, this is also the moment when the tyranny of realism just snuffs out fantasy. Because look at what happens to Blanche after. She becomes completely catatonic, but there is, and this is perhaps the final thing I'll say, there is this interesting moment near the end that's worth discussing. So we learn at the beginning of scene 11 that some weeks have passed, and we also learn that Stella rejects Blanche's narrative, which is the truth, and she doesn't believe that Stanley, in fact, raped her. She seems to believe that this is just something Blanche has fabricated, perhaps a suggestion or a signifier or a symbol of her mind deteriorating to the point that she can no longer distinguish between fact and fiction, truth and lies. And this doctor and this nurse appear, presumably to take her to an institution. And I always remind my students of this because of when this play was written, it's entirely possible that at some point Blanche was lobotomized, which again only adds another layer to just how tragic this story is for Blanche. But notice how the nurse or the matron interacts with her, because I think part of what Williams does here in this final scene is to show how we have fully entered the world of Stanley. This is now Stanley's world. And even the way Williams describes how this nurse or this matron interacts with Blanche, I think it feels like an extension of a character like Stanley. For example, we're told that her voice is bold and toneless as a fire bell. She says, again, she's very curt, "Hello, Blanche. That's all right. It don't matter. We can pick it up later." Just everything is very staccato. Again, there doesn't seem to be any real sympathy here. And you'll notice Blanche, she's quite hesitant and trepidatious. Again, perhaps seeing through this nurse and really just underneath seeing the ethos of Stanley. But something then happens. The doctor doesn't address her by her first name. He addresses her as Miss Dubois. Miss Dubois, She turns her face to him and stares at him with desperate pleading. He smiles. Then he speaks to the matron. It won't be necessary. Ask her to let go of me. The doctor to the matron. Let go. The matron releases her. Blanche extends her hand toward the doctor. He draws her up gently and supports her with his arm and leads her through the portiere. Holding tight to his arm. Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. So I think the question worth asking here is, what does Blanche see in this doctor that persuades her? And I think perhaps part of it is, or maybe all of it is, or a large portion of it is, how he addresses her. He doesn't address her by her first name or with her first name. He addresses her as Miss Dubois, which you could almost imagine that address is this retreat momentarily into the past. At least maybe that's one way to imagine how Blanche reads this. Now, perhaps another way is just to imagine that he's a man who behaves politely. And we've already seen how Blanche reacts to figures like Mitch, for example, figures who seem to be sensitive, caring, empathetic, if we just wanted to be simple about it, non-Stanley men. So perhaps that's what she sees here as well. But if we wanted to just continue to think through the tragedy of Blanche, I think it's embodied or epitomized in what she actually says, her last line of the play. I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. Because there's something perhaps contradictory about this statement, that it's people she doesn't know that have been the most dependable, which is to say those she does know are perhaps by extension the least dependable. And I think there is something unmistakably tragic about that idea. Okay, because of time constraints, I think that's where I will stop. Again, A Streetcar Named Desire, I would argue, is the sort of play that invites so many possibilities. If you wanted to write about it, you could write about a single character, particular themes, dynamics between different characters, what Williams does with the stage itself as understood through these stage directions, and there's even a film version. And I'll perhaps link to particular clips, not in the notes for this recording, but I think I might just put it in the announcements feed here in just a few minutes. But again, I think A Streetcar Named Desire is a great play to write about, and I would love to read a rough draft, so don't forget about that rough draft folder. But until we speak again, this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature.